Welcome friends. Today we are replacing some ignition components, sensors, and we're also diagnosing why the Jeep left me stranded at the police station while I was getting the VIN verified for registration. So the previous owner said that he thinks that the starting issue is the crankshaft position sensor, and after watching some YouTube videos I decided to replace the camshaft sensor also. Since that's the easiest one to get to, we're going to start right there and maintain the momentum throughout. So the camshaft position sensor was super easy. It's 2 bolts, 6mm socket, take the old one off, put the new one on, easy as that. I knew that crankshaft position sensor was going to be difficult to get to, so since I wanted to maintain that momentum, I just swapped out the ignition coil and the spark plugs next. A 13mm socket and a 2-inch extension is what I needed to help me get off the 4 bolts that are holding on that ignition coil, specifically because it gets really tight toward the back of the engine. You should be able to tug the ignition coil rail right off, but the previous owner installed this aftermarket alternator which had an extra bracket on the back that prevented removal. The right answer is to remove the belt, remove one of the alternator mount bolts, and clock it out of the way, but I just ended up wiggling the coil rail out diagonally instead. Once you actually get the rail off of the spark plugs, you still have to unclip it at the back of the engine. So just remove that clip. It's a little challenging to get off, and then you can pull the rail right out. After I got the rail out of the way, I needed to make sure I could vacuum up and get rid of any debris that had fallen into the area where the spark plugs were at, because I didn't want any of that junk falling into the cylinder. The spark plugs use a standard 5/8 inch socket. I recommend using a dedicated spark plug socket just because it's so much easier to get them out and put them back in. They usually use a magnet or some other friction method to hold that spark plug in there. Well worth the effort. Because of this alternator, I did end up having to use a swivel joint only on this first cylinder. After I got the new one in, I torqued it down to 27 foot-pounds. Alright, so announcement. Dielectric grease goes on the inside of the boot, but not on the actual connector. You don't want it on the connector. You just want it inside of the boot to allow everything to slide on and off easily. I will mention that this Hitachi ignition coil rail is supposed to be a bit of an upgrade, but I wish I had known that there was a better one using a Viper coil, and I'll link that in the description. Even though the crankshaft position sensor is on the back of the driver's side of the engine, the connector is located on the passenger side, just behind the oil filter. After using two hands to remove the connector, I used a 10mm socket, a swivel joint, and an 18-inch extension to loosen and remove the crankshaft position sensor bolt. I used a magnet to remove the bolt completely. After breaking the sensor trying to remove it via the metal grommet with a Torx bit, I figured out that I could just reach my lady hands up near the cats and pull the sensor up and out that way. I immediately put the new one in the exact same way that I got the old one out. I learned that the trick to this is putting some grease on the inside of the socket or on the bolt head so that it'll stay in there whenever you're using the swivel joint to position it properly and screw it back in. Running the sensor wire back over top of the transmission and behind the engine was surprisingly the hardest part of this for me. I cut out a whole bunch of this, but it took me a really long time to figure out how to get it positioned properly. If you have a claw grabber, that might be your best bet to just whip it back behind the engine. No dice. The crankshaft sensor was not the issue. The previous owner said that it was a new battery, so I started parallel planning for fuel issues. But after buying a battery charger, I noticed that the battery was being drained every night it wasn't plugged in. That, coupled with the fact that the interior lights needed to be turned off manually and the wipers were running with the vehicle off, made me suspect that there was an electrical problem, probably related to the body control module. I have no idea if these are stock terminals, but it took a 12mm socket to loosen the terminal and pull off the negative side to start trying to diagnose with a multimeter where this drain was coming from. I watched a couple tutorials on how to diagnose parasitic battery drain, and they all recommended putting the multimeter between the negative wire clamp and the negative battery terminal with the automatic amp setting or the 10 amp setting if the multimeter isn't automatic. Doing this test will help you figure out how much power is being drawn from the battery. A good number is around 25 milliamps. For the first day that I was doing this, I was reading my draw at only 2 decimal places, not realizing that what I thought was 65 milliamps was actually 650 milliamps of draw, which is insane. After removing that sketchy amp wiring that I'm sure everyone was screaming that was my problem, I still had the draw, and I proceeded to start removing fuses one at a time and checking for changes in the draw. If the draw dropped, that meant that whatever fuse I pulled was providing power to the source of my draw. I should mention that the door sensors on the WJ are in the physical lock mechanism, but the hood doesn't actually have a sensor, at least mine doesn't. Or maybe it just doesn't have one that works. These sensors can trigger a power draw and a misdiagnosis, so you have to be careful with that. Make sure that the doors are closed and make sure that you let it sit for a second so that all of the sensors reset. Fuse number 3 was just the first of 3 fuses which caused a drop in my draw. All 3 fuses started with JB, which meant that they had to be further diagnosed at the junction box, or the fuse box, which was located near the hood release in the driver footwell. If you have a fancy fuse puller, you can probably get away with just pulling off that cover, but I didn't, so I needed to remove a whole bunch of trim using a Phillips head screwdriver and a 10mm socket. When everything was finally out of the way, I took a second to put in a fog light relay I got at the junkyard for a fog light retrofit that I'm doing later on. Spoiler on that, if your Jeep was not pre-wired for fog lights, you can still install them using a stock relay and switch. I'll save it for the lighting or body episode, but if you need to know now, just ask in the comments. In a tutorial that I watched, a guy had some really long leads and was able to throw the multimeter up on the windshield to see changes from inside of the cab, but I had to walk back and forth for each fuse. But again, I needed to close the latch on my door while doing this so that the sensor didn't cause any misdiagnosis. After a while of running through all the fuses in the driver's footwell, I found that the issue was the body control module. All my research online gave me confirmation bias already that this whole problem was the BCM draining the battery because of a short in the door or a faulty door latch sensor causing everything to stay on. The door ground was already torn, and I imagine that there were probably other wires which were broken inside of the insulation that I just couldn't see. It was at this point where I decided to completely eliminate the possibility of there being a short somewhere else in the car due to all this aftermarket speaker wiring. After getting rid of the wiring, I started just tearing apart both of the front doors to look for any wiring issues going around the entire vehicle. I had already replaced the window regulator on the rear driver's side, so I had both of the rear doors off at one point, and I knew that there were no issues there, so I just had to keep looking. After a lot of effort, I got absolutely nowhere. I figured I should replace the battery because even if it was new, it was getting destroyed with drain on a daily basis. This also provided me an opportunity to get an AGM instead of a standard flooded lead acid battery. But before swapping them, I tested the old battery, which had been sitting overnight, and to my surprise, it was still charged. And I had no idea why it was still charged. It made 0 sense to me, and I felt like an idiot for spending $250 on a new battery. In order to eliminate all obvious possibilities, I decided to replace the battery terminals and install some new wire loom to replace the aging stuff that's all around the engine. First, I removed the old terminals and cleaned the copper wiring with a vinegar and salt mixture. The right tool for installing copper wire terminals is actually a hydraulic crimper, but I already have one at my house in Washington and I didn't want to spend another $70 for the correct tool. So I used a $20 crimper from Advanced Auto and my jack arms to leverage for the crimp. I put a copper terminal on each of the wires and then I bolted those to the actual battery terminals. I originally bought some wire loom off Amazon, but it was way too big and I ended up taking it off and replacing it with some split loom from O'Reilly's. I melted the ends of the loom after I cut them and then I taped them after the install on either end. I definitely regret buying electrical tape from Harbor Freight and I wish I would have just paid the extra money for 3M electrical tape. It takes a really long time, but it's definitely really good to redo the loom that runs behind the valve cover and the loom on the injector wires. I didn't do this prior to replacing the valve cover gasket and I was stuck spending a whole bunch of time cleaning out broken pieces of plastic from the valve train. So I also ended up fixing the ABS sensor, which I noticed was completely ripped apart by the front drive shaft. I got a new sensor from the junkyard along with the vehicle side connector to replace the damaged one. This sensor, the ABS sensor or the wheel speed sensor, is bolted into the back of the steering knuckle and requires an 8mm socket to remove. It is then held onto the knuckle and axle in several locations with brackets, and you can just pop the wire right off of those brackets and install the new sensor in the same route. I replaced the clip on the vehicle side using butt connectors and heat shrink. I also ended up noticing while I was down here that the transfer case wire was dragging on the front drive shaft as well, so I moved that out of the way and zip tied it up. I also wanted to fix the ground for the driver's door, which looked like someone had tried to fix it before but hadn't finished. Before I fixed that connection, I tried to fix the door check hinge, which was broken and prevented the door from staying open on its own. I replaced it with one that I got at the junkyard. The ground had already been completely replaced on the vehicle side, but the connection wasn't good and the protective rubber hadn't been reconnected either. I used a butt connector and heat shrink to fix the connection and made sure that the connector didn't interfere with door operation before resealing everything. Despite all these small fixes, the battery still had a drain and needed to be kept on a battery tender. Now, these episodes are not in chronological order because I wanted to make sure I could tell a whole organized story from start to finish without a cliffhanger. And I had plenty of other things to do to keep me busy, including installing interior lighting kits and an OEM radio. I was sitting in the passenger seat of the Jeep, and after running the radio, I switched off the ignition and pulled out the key. The radio turned off for a second and then turned back on. I was very confused, but after messing with the ignition and doing some Google searches, I found that my ignition cylinder was broken and was allowing the key to be removed when the cylinder was in the accessory position. This meant that everything stayed on even when I thought it was turned off. The answer then is a new ignition cylinder. You can buy them at your local auto parts store, but most of the time they require you to get an entirely new key. That's a problem because the WJ comes with what Jeep calls the Sentry Key Immobilizer System, which includes RFI chips inside of the key, which will not allow the vehicle to run without a key programmed to the ECU. I figured all this out while trying to buy additional keys for the WJ since it only came with one. YouTubers had promised me that even though I only had one key, I could cheaply buy new keys on Amazon, go to the hardware store and get them cut, and then go to a locksmith to get them coated. Well, Lowe's wouldn't cut it or coat it. They said I had to buy one of their cut and coated keys for $65 to $95. Home Depot did cut the Amazon keys for me, but they wouldn't code them. And when I went to the locksmiths, trying to get them to code them, they said that they would charge me $50 to $90 to code each key. So the bottom line here is just buy new coded keys from Home Depot or Lowe's, since it's cheaper than buying Amazon keys and getting them cut and coded, at least in my experience in my area. I did briefly consider having the Sentry Key module coded out. You can send your ECU off to do that. But I'd rather pay for coding if I lose a key or pay for a new module if it breaks than lose the investment of time and money in this Jeep if it gets stolen. Anyway, I ended up finding an ignition cylinder which actually allows you to keep your old key. You simply remove the old cylinder by putting the key into position 1, use a screwdriver to push up on the release button underneath the steering column, and pull the old cylinder out. Next, insert the key into the new learning cylinder, give it a full turn clockwise, and then a full turn counterclockwise, and then carefully pull it out. Put that new cylinder into the cylinder casing, and reinstall your new cylinder into the steering column. After the install, the key could no longer be removed when it was an accessory or when it was turned on, only when it was in the off position. I then verified the fix by retesting the battery draw, and I found that after an initial connection, the various vehicle systems would run for about 20 to 30 seconds before finally dropping to an acceptable drain of only 19 milliamps for my particular vehicle. Alright, so the most expensive thing for this episode was definitely the new battery. Even after a discount and a core refund, it still cost me $230 for the AGM battery. Is AGM necessary? Absolutely not, but I prefer something maintenance-free and leak-free. The ignition coil replacement was also pretty expensive, but I figured it was worth it for the peace of mind. And again, I'll add that upgraded Viper coil down in the description. Finally, the real fix for this whole episode was the ignition cylinder for $105. Total for the episode was $607, bringing the total for the project up to $3,144. Now remember, my goal for this, the entire project, was supposed to be $4K, but that's obviously not going to work out, especially because I've been breaking the bank buying new tools to actually do repairs throughout this project. My first takeaway from this episode was that diagnosing the electrical issues was really hard and really stressful. And I seriously got lucky figuring out the ignition cylinder issue. Otherwise, I would have just started replacing all the latches and all 4 doors with brand new parts because I didn't want to get a defective junkyard part. I also learned a lot about Jeep's SKIM system, and let's get real. If people can steal new BMWs with $400 worth of commercial off-the-shelf equipment, then they can steal this Jeep. But people can also probably kick in most people's front door, but that doesn't mean you don't lock your house, right? Deterrence is about not being an easy target, so I'm going to keep the SKIM despite any expensive repairs. Now, I did a few crappy electrical repairs in this episode using a lighter at first and then a heat gun, and now I actually have a heat tool for those repairs. The right tool for the job will always make your repairs easier, whether that's using a heat gun or it's using an actual hydraulic battery terminal crimper instead of just a normal hand one from the store. Next episode will be all about the engine, and you get to see me make several mistakes and learn why you don't use a mallet on a harmonic balancer. Hopefully you got something out of this episode. My wife is always making fun of how boring I am, but I like to think that if I had a motto, it would be less personality and more functionality. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.